In the quiet suburbs of Tallahassee, Florida, a community awoke to an unthinkable tragedy. On November 20 in the year 2010, 27-year-old Brandy Peters and her three young children, 6-year-old twins Tamaya and Tania and 3-year-old Javante, were discovered lifeless in their home. The brutality of the crime scene left even seasoned investigators shaken. As detectives delved deeper, they uncovered a web of relationships and secrets that would lead to a complex and controversial investigation. What transpired within those walls, and who could commit such a heinous act against an innocent family? Join us as we explore the harrowing details of this case, seeking to understand the events that led to that fateful day. In the heart of Tallahassee, Florida, nestled within a quiet, unassuming neighborhood, stood the modest home of Brandy Peters. It was a place that, to outsiders, looked like any other suburban residence. A small house with a neat lawn where children's toys were often scattered, a testament to the vibrant life within. Brandy, just 27 years old, lived there with her three young children. 6-year-old twin daughters Tamia and Tania, and her 3-year-old son Javante. For Brandy, they were her world, her pride, her joy, and her ultimate reason for persevering through the challenges life had thrown her way. Brandy was no stranger to hardship. As a single mother, she juggled the demands of raising 3 children on her own while grappling with financial struggles that often left her stretched thin. She worked tirelessly to provide for her family, doing whatever it took to ensure her children had a roof over their heads and food on the table. Friends and neighbors described her as resilient, a woman who carried her burdens with a quiet strength. She was fiercely devoted to her children, always putting their needs above her own, and doing her best to create a sense of normalcy despite her circumstances. Her twin daughters, Tamia and Tania, were inseparable. With their matching smiles and boundless energy, they were the heartbeat of the household, often seen running through the yard giggling as they played. Javante, the youngest, was her baby boy, a curious toddler with big brown eyes who adored his sisters and rarely left their side. Together, they were a tight-knit family, finding joy in the small moments, shared meals, bedtime stories, and evenings spent watching cartoons. But beneath the surface, Brandy's life was far from picture perfect. Financial troubles loomed large. She had a long-standing dispute with Javante's father, Henry Segura, over unpaid child support. The tension between them was no secret. Court records showed that Segura owed nearly $20,000 in back payments, a mounting debt that created friction in their already strained relationship. Despite the challenges, Brandy held her ground. She was determined to fight for what her children deserved, even if it meant enduring uncomfortable confrontations. Still, life went on. Brandy's home on Saddle Creek Run was filled with the kind of noise and chaos only a house with 3 children can have. Laughter echoed through the walls, interrupted occasionally by the squabbles of siblings. It was a house alive with the innocence of childhood, where every corner held a memory, a piece of the family's shared history. The neighborhood itself was quiet, a typical suburban enclave in Tallahassee, where neighbors waved at each other in passing and children played on the sidewalks. It was the kind of place where everyone assumed they were safe, where doors were often left unlocked, and where the unthinkable seemed impossible. But, as the community would soon learn, appearances could be deceiving. In the weeks leading up to November 20 in the year 2010, there were no obvious signs that something was amiss. Brandy carried on with her daily routine, taking care of her children and trying to make ends meet. Neighbors noticed nothing out of the ordinary. To the outside world, it seemed like life was continuing as usual in the Peters household. But life has a way of concealing its shadows, and behind the smiles and the laughter, a storm was quietly brewing, one that would leave an entire community in shock and 3 innocent children without a future. On that fateful November evening, the stillness of the neighborhood would be shattered. A phone call to 911 would bring law enforcement to the home on Saddle Creek Run, where they would uncover a scene so horrific that it would haunt even the most experienced detectives. What they found inside that house would send shockwaves through Tallahassee and beyond, sparking an investigation that would reveal long-buried secrets and leave more questions than answers. How could such a tragedy unfold in a family filled with so much love? What forces had been at play beneath the surface of Brandy Peters' life? And most importantly, who could have committed such an unfathomable act against this young mother and her 3 children? These questions would linger as the investigation began, unraveling a story that was as complex as it was heartbreaking. On the morning of November 20 in the year 2010, A concerned call to the Tallahassee Police Department set in motion one of the most haunting investigations in the city's history. The caller, a close friend of Brandy Peters, was worried. She hadn't heard from Brandy in over 24 hours, an unusual silence for the mother of three who was known to keep in touch with those close to her. Brandy's home at 894 Saddle Creek Run was usually alive with the sound of her 6-year-old twin daughters Tamia and Tania, and her 3-year-old son Javante. But that day, there was an eerie stillness. When officers arrived, the house seemed normal at first glance. Nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the home appeared unassuming. But as the officers approached the door, they noticed something was wrong. The front door wasn't locked, it was slightly ajar. Cautiously, they entered, calling out for anyone inside. Their voices echoed back to them, but there was no response. The first thing they noticed was chaos. A toppled potted plant lay in the entryway, its soil scattered across the floor. Further inside, a broken fake fingernail lay near a smear of blood on the wall. The signs of a violent struggle were immediately apparent. Furniture was overturned, and the remnants of shattered glass crunched underfoot as the officers moved further into the house. Whatever had happened here, it hadn't been quick or quiet. Then they found her. In the living room, Brandy Peters' lifeless body lay sprawled on the floor. She had been shot multiple times, her injuries showing the brutal precision of close-range gunfire. Investigators would later determine she had been shot 4 times, once in the head, once in the ear, and twice in the chest and abdomen. The placement of the wounds suggested a deeply personal and deliberate attack. Blood pooled beneath her, and it was clear she had fought for her life. Defensive wounds on her hands told the story of a mother who hadn't gone down without a fight. But the horror didn't stop there. As officers continued through the house, they came across a locked bathroom door. Forcing it open, they discovered a scene that would leave even seasoned investigators shaken. In the bathtub, which was still partially filled with water, lay the bodies of Brandy's 3 children. Tamia and Tania, her 6-year-old twins, and Javante, just 3 years old, had all been drowned. The small bodies, limp and lifeless, told a story of sheer cruelty and desperation. Investigators would later theorize that the children had witnessed the attack on their mother and had been killed to silence them. The discovery of the children was a breaking point for many of the officers on the scene. The innocence of the victims and the brutality of their deaths made it clear that this was not a random act of violence. Whoever committed this crime had come prepared, intending to leave no witnesses behind. The crime scene was chaotic but offered some initial clues. Blood spatter patterns hinted at a prolonged altercation in multiple areas of the house. Broken items suggested that Brandy had tried to fend off her attacker, likely in an effort to protect her children. The house showed no signs of forced entry, leading investigators to consider the possibility that Brandy knew her killer and had willingly let them inside. As news of the murders spread, the close-knit neighborhood was consumed with fear and disbelief. Who could commit such a heinous act against a mother and her children? Friends and neighbors described Brandy as a devoted mother who worked tirelessly to provide for her family. She had her struggles, but she always seemed to prioritize her children above all else. Now, all 4 lives had been extinguished in one horrifying night. The brutality of the crime scene, the deliberate targeting of the children, and the personal nature of Brandy's wounds pointed to someone with a vendetta. But who and why? The answers would prove to be as tangled and shocking as the crime itself. As investigators began piecing together the events of that night, they realized they were dealing with a case unlike any other, a case that would uncover secrets, reveal surprising suspects, and leave the community searching for justice for years to come. As investigators arrived at 822 Saddle Creek Run on that tragic November morning in the year 2010, they were met with a sight that would haunt them for years to come. Inside the modest home, 27-year-old Brandy Peters lay lifeless in a pool of blood, evidence of a violent and frenzied attack etched into every corner of the house. Nearby, the bodies of her twin daughters, Tamia and Tania, just 6 years old, were discovered. Small and fragile lives cut short far too soon. In the bathroom, 3-year-old Javante's tiny body was found submerged in water, a scene so horrific it left even seasoned law enforcement officers shaken. The crime scene painted a grim portrait of the events that had unfolded. Broken furniture, blood splatters across the walls, and signs of a desperate struggle told the story of a mother's fight to protect her children. Brandy's injuries revealed the ferocity of the attack, Gunshot wounds and physical trauma suggested she had faced her killer head-on, fighting with every ounce of strength she had. Her children, however, appeared to have been defenseless, their small frames offering no resistance to the violence that claimed their lives. The detectives tasked with unraveling this mystery knew they were dealing with something deeply personal. The brutality of the attack suggested rage, an intimate and emotional connection between the perpetrator and the victims. A random break-in didn't make sense, especially not in this quiet suburban neighborhood of Tallahassee. But if this wasn't a random act, then who would have wanted to destroy an entire family? Their first step was to reconstruct the final hours of Brandy's life. Interviews with neighbors revealed that she had been seen earlier that day, going about her routine as a single mother juggling the demands of raising 3 young children. Friends described her as a fiercely devoted parent who would do anything for her kids. Yet beneath that exterior, there were whispers of tension, financial struggles, complicated relationships, and connections that would soon come under the microscope. Investigators began canvassing the area, questioning neighbors and searching for surveillance footage that might hold a clue. A few neighbors reported hearing what sounded like gunshots late the previous night, but no one had called the police. Some had seen a dark vehicle parked near the house earlier in the evening, but the details were vague. With little to go on, detectives turned their attention to the evidence inside the home. Forensic teams worked tirelessly to collect DNA samples, fingerprints, and any trace evidence that might point to a suspect. The blood patterns indicated a chaotic struggle, with Brandy fighting back against her attacker. There were signs of forced entry at the front door, suggesting the killer had broken in. But the question remained, was this someone she knew, or a stranger intent on violence? As investigators dug deeper into Brandy's life, they discovered a complex web of relationships and potential motives. Brandy, a single mother, was navigating financial hardships, including mounting child support disputes. At the center of these disputes was Henry Segura, the father of Javante, her youngest child. Henry had reportedly fallen behind on his child support payments, owing thousands of dollars to Brandy, a debt that had become a point of contention between them. Detectives couldn't ignore the possibility that the financial strain and conflict might have escalated into something far more dangerous. But there was another layer to the story. Rumors surfaced about Brandy's alleged connections to drug trafficking, raising the possibility that her murder could have been linked to something far more sinister. Was this a targeted attack by individuals seeking to settle a score? Or was it a deeply personal crime fueled by anger and resentment? The autopsies provided further insight into the brutality of the crime. Brandy's injuries confirmed she had been shot multiple times, and defensive wounds on her hands and arms showed she had fought back fiercely. The children's cause of death, however, was even more harrowing. Evidence suggested they had been drowned, a calculated and methodical act that pointed to a cold-blooded killer. As the days turned into weeks, the pressure to solve the case mounted. The Tallahassee Police Department worked around the clock, sifting through evidence and following up on leads. Tips poured in from the public, but none seemed to provide the breakthrough investigators so desperately needed. The community, shaken by the loss of such a young and vibrant family, demanded answers. Who could commit such a heinous act, and why? Eventually, the investigation circled back to Henry Segura. His strained relationship with Brandy and the mounting child support debt made him an obvious person of interest. Detectives learned that Henry had a history of deception. He had been living a double life, maintaining relationships with multiple women while fathering several children. His alibi for the night of the murders seemed shaky, and inconsistencies in his statements only added to the suspicion surrounding him. But Henry denied any involvement in the murders. He claimed he had no reason to harm Brandy or the children, insisting that the debt wasn't enough to drive him to such violence. Despite his denials, investigators couldn't ignore the mounting circumstantial evidence pointing in his direction. Yet, as the case unfolded, the shadow of doubt lingered. Was Henry Segura the man responsible for this horrific crime, or was there another explanation, a hidden truth buried beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered? The investigation was only beginning, and the path to justice would prove to be as complex and heart-wrenching as the crime itself. In the aftermath of the tragic murders of Brandy Peters and her 3 children, the legal proceedings against Henry Segura unfolded over several years, marked by intense courtroom battles and complex narratives. Henry Segura stood accused of the year 2010 murders of his ex-girlfriend, Brandy Peters, and her 3 children, including his own son, Javante. The prosecution argued that Segura committed the murders to avoid paying substantial child support arrears. They presented evidence suggesting that Segura had both motive and opportunity, highlighting his financial struggles and alleged attempts to evade child support payments. The defense countered with an alternative theory, suggesting that the murders were the result of a drug cartel hit due to Brandy Peters' alleged involvement in drug trafficking. They introduced testimonies and evidence pointing to multiple assailants, arguing that the brutality and complexity of the crime scene indicated a professional hit rather than a crime committed by a single individual. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict, leading the judge to declare a mistrial. This outcome underscored the complexities and challenges inherent in the case, leaving the families of the victims and the accused without closure. 2 years later, in the year 2019, Henry Segura was retried for the quadruple homicide. The prosecution reinforced their original arguments, presenting additional evidence to strengthen their case against Segura. They emphasized forensic evidence and witness testimonies that they argued linked Segura directly to the crime scene. The defense maintained their stance on the cartel theory, bringing forth new witnesses, including individuals claiming to have knowledge of a cartel-ordered hit on Brandy Peters. They aimed to cast reasonable doubt on Segura's guilt by highlighting alternative suspects and questioning the thoroughness of the initial investigation. Despite the defense's efforts, the jury found Henry Segura guilty on all counts. He was subsequently sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This verdict brought a sense of resolution to a case that had lingered in uncertainty for nearly a decade, though debates over the true circumstances of the crime continue to persist. The trials of Henry Segura highlighted the intricate interplay of evidence, legal strategy, and the search for justice in a case that captivated and divided public opinion. As the investigation into the brutal murders of Brandy Peters and her 3 children progressed, it became clear that this was no straightforward case. What began as a horrifying discovery in a quiet Tallahassee home soon unraveled into a maze of theories, conflicting evidence, and lingering questions that would divide public opinion for years. One of the most controversial theories floated during the trial was that Brandy Peters had become entangled with a dangerous drug cartel. According to the defense, Peters had reportedly been working with drug traffickers, and the murders were not a crime of passion or domestic violence, but rather an execution, a calculated move to send a chilling message. This theory gained traction when the defense introduced the testimony of James Carlos Santos, a convicted gang member serving time in federal prison. Santos claimed that the murders were ordered by his associates because Peters had allegedly stolen drugs or money. According to his account, Brandy was deeply involved in the drug trade, a fact that investigators supposedly overlooked or downplayed. He chillingly described how such acts of vengeance were commonplace in the cartel world, a gruesome reminder to others not to betray the organization. Yet, despite the gravity of Santos's claims, his credibility came under scrutiny. Santos had a history of criminal activity and had much to gain from fabricating a story in exchange for leniency in his own sentencing. Moreover, his decision to invoke his Fifth Amendment rights when pressed further weakened the defense's argument. Still, his testimony planted a seed of doubt. Could this truly have been a cartel hit? The crime scene itself seemed to tell a chaotic and unsettling story, one that didn't align neatly with the prosecution's version of events. Evidence suggested that multiple individuals may have been involved in the attack. Investigators found footprints of varying sizes in the home, as well as indications that different weapons had been used to carry out the murders. These details led some to believe that this was not the work of a single individual, but a group. The defense pointed to this as further proof of cartel involvement, arguing that such a methodical, multi-perpetrator crime was consistent with how cartels operated. It was alleged that Brandy's house had been staged in a way that only someone familiar with cartel retaliation tactics would understand. Forensic experts testified that the multiple shoe prints, coupled with the manner in which the children were killed, hinted at a coordinated attack rather than a crime committed in a moment of rage by one person. This theory, however, faced its own challenges. The prosecution argued that the presence of multiple shoe prints didn't necessarily mean there were multiple attackers. It could have been a result of contamination during the investigation or other visitors to the home prior to the murders. Additionally, while different weapons may have been used, they posited that a single person could have used multiple tools in the chaos of the attack. The ambiguity of this evidence left the jury to grapple with an unsettling question. Was Henry Segura truly the sole perpetrator? Or were others involved? DNA analysis played a pivotal role in shaping the narrative around the case, but it also introduced more questions than answers. During the investigation, authorities discovered DNA from unidentified individuals at the crime scene, including material linked to a man named Angel Avila Quiñones, a known drug runner. His DNA was found on a phone cradle in Peters's home, a seemingly innocuous detail that the defense claimed was anything but. The presence of Avila Quiñones' DNA raised eyebrows. Could someone with direct ties to the drug world have been at the house on the night of the murders? And if so, why wasn't he investigated further? The defense highlighted this as a glaring oversight, arguing that it was a significant clue pointing to Brandy's alleged connection to the cartel and potential alternative suspects. But the prosecution countered by arguing that the DNA evidence was inconclusive. Avila Quiñones' DNA could have been transferred to the house during an earlier visit, they said, and it didn't prove he was present during the murders. Furthermore, no other evidence tied him directly to the crime. Once again, the jury was left to weigh conflicting interpretations of the same piece of evidence, adding yet another layer of uncertainty to the case. From the outset, law enforcement zeroed in on Henry Segura as the prime suspect. As the father of Brandy's youngest child, Javante, and someone with a documented history of disputes with Brandy over unpaid child support, Segura fit the profile of someone with a potential motive. But the defense argued that this narrow focus caused investigators to overlook other, more plausible leads. Critics of the investigation pointed to several inconsistencies and gaps in the police work. For example, while evidence at the crime scene suggested multiple attackers, law enforcement never seriously pursued the theory that others were involved. The defense accused the authorities of tunnel vision, of building a case around Segura while ignoring evidence that might exonerate him. Even more damning were allegations that law enforcement failed to thoroughly investigate Brandy's alleged ties to the drug world, brushing aside the possibility that her death was connected to criminal activities beyond her domestic life. On the other hand, the prosecution argued that this criticism was unwarranted. They insisted that all reasonable leads were explored and that the evidence against Segura was overwhelming. They pointed to his suspicious behavior after the murders, including fleeing to Minnesota and failing to account for his whereabouts on the night of the crime. To them, the case against Segura was clear-cut. But to many observers, the investigation's perceived shortcomings cast a shadow over the trial and its outcome. The controversies surrounding the case didn't end with the trials. Public opinion remains sharply divided, with many believing that Henry Segura is innocent and was wrongfully convicted. They point to the unanswered questions, the gaps in the investigation, and the plausible, alternative theories as evidence that the true perpetrators of the crime may still be out there. Others, however, are convinced of Segura's guilt, citing the prosecution's timeline, his alleged motive, and the forensic evidence as proof that he acted alone. The debate has kept the case alive in the public consciousness, with some viewing it as a cautionary tale about the complexity of justice, while others see it as a tragic reminder of how lives can be destroyed by a single act of violence. As the years have passed, the case of Brandy Peters and her children continues to haunt those who have followed it. The alternative theories and controversies surrounding the investigation serve as a stark reminder of how elusive the truth can be, especially in the face of conflicting evidence and human fallibility. To this day, the case raises a difficult question. Did the system deliver justice? Or did it condemn an innocent man while the real culprits remain free? After years of investigations, mistrials, and courtroom battles, Henry Segura was ultimately convicted for the murders of Brandy Peters and her 3 children. A jury found him guilty of carrying out a crime so violent, so personal, that it sent shockwaves across the nation. But even as Segura sits in prison proclaiming his innocence, questions linger in the minds of many who have followed this case closely. Was justice truly served? The defense's claim that this was a cartel-ordered hit raises unsettling possibilities. What if Brandy's connections to dangerous individuals had indeed put her and her children in harm's way? Did the investigators, desperate for closure, focus too intently on Segura and ignore the broader web of potential suspects? For the families of Brandy, Tamia, Tania, and Javante, there can never truly be peace. 4 lives were stolen in the most horrific way, leaving a void that can never be filled. The twin girls, who dreamed of being dancers, and little Javante, whose smile lit up every room, were robbed of their futures. This case is a tragic reminder of the complexity of justice. It forces us to reflect on how society approaches violence within families and the broader systems that fail to protect the most vulnerable. For those who remember Brandy Peters, she was a mother who loved fiercely. She fought for her children, even in her final moments. And though her life was cut short, the love she had for her kids will never be forgotten. As we close the chapter on this story, one question remains. How many more stories like this are happening right now, in homes that seem perfectly ordinary from the outside? And how can we as a society prevent another tragedy like this? If this story touched you, I encourage you to share your thoughts below. Join us in continuing the conversation about the importance of justice, safety, and the lives that deserve to be remembered. Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more true crime stories like this one. Together we can keep these stories alive, not for the darkness they carry, but for the light we can find in their lessons.